Hello, and welcome to this tutorial where I'm going to show you how to build a minimal sample in React using Oracle Content and Experience as a headless CMS. My name is Leena Shah, and I'm a developer at Oracle working on the content management headless samples. So let's get started. The first thing we want to do is to clone the repository in GitHub. This is the universal React minimal sample that is already set up to use Oracle Content Management. The code on GitHub is available for you to contribute to and give feedback on. Let's go ahead and clone this repository from GitHub. Open a command prompt and do a git clone. Now let's change our current directory to the newly created directory. Open the sample with the code editor of your choice. I will be using Visual Studio Code. The first thing we want to do is install the dependencies of this project by doing an npm install. Now, while that is running, let's take a look at some of the files in this sample. Note the package.json file, which has all the scripts that are necessary to build and run the sample. You also have all the dependencies for the sample listed here. Note that this sample has a dependency on the content management SDK. Also note the Webpack configuration files listed here. Next, let's take a look at the .env file, which is the configuration file. We use environment variables to store configuration information about the Oracle Content Management Server. The server listed in server URL is a public Oracle Content Management Server. The channel token is what will be used by React to authenticate into our server instance. One thing that's really important is to ensure that you configure your cross-origin resource sharing to avoid any distributed denial of service attack, DDoS. It is best not to check in this information as part of your source-controlled code, because attackers may use it to attempt to access your OCE instance. As you can see in the terminal, the dependencies have been downloaded. Now let's fire up a build by running the command npm run build. This is going to put together several bundles, both a server bundle and a client bundle that will make our universal React sample available on the local machine. Once this is done, let us fire up a development server by running the command npm run start. What this does is fire up an Express server at port 8080. Now let's head over to the browser and see the sample in action. As you can see, here's our headless React minimal sample homepage. It contains a header, a list of page in the navigation bar, and a footer. For this sample, we are using an asset type called called minimal main as the main content type. This content type contains a header and a footer logo and a list of pages that should be included on the nav. The page is of the asset type minimal page. Minimal page in turn contains a list of content items that are of the asset type minimal section. Let's take a look at the second page for this application, which is Contact Us. Contact Us consists of 3 sections, as you can see. This is section 1, 2, and 3. The home page also contains sections, section 1 and section 2. Let's go ahead and take a look at the code which is making all of this possible. Now, all the source code for this sample is contained in the folder source. Let's go ahead and take a look at the scripts folder and the file server config utils inside of it. Oracle Content Management makes available a content SDK for anyone who wants to build a headless application to use in conjunction with a specific application framework. One of the things it does is instantiate a new client that will enable one to access the content stored in the server. Here you see a method called getClient, which is making use of the environment variables that we had seen earlier in the .env file. And it's using the content SDK methods to create a client. Next, let's take a look at services.js. Here you will find methods that encapsulate calls to the content SDK and return the data back to the React components to be rendered. For example, here is a method that uses the content SDK client to fetch the items given a slug. Similarly, here is a method that calls the content SDK to get a content item which has a slug of minimal main. In short, this file contains all the content SDK calls the sample needs to render the data. Let's take a look at source pages router.js. This is the global router that is shared between the server and the client. The router will route to the appropriate page component for the request path, and these in turn could use subcomponents that are defined in the components folder. This sample uses only one route, /page, followed by the slug. And this is routed to the page component that you will find in the pages folder. This file is also using the app component, so let's take a look at that. As you can see, app is also a React component, and it uses some of the lifecycle methods of a React component. Here we have a fetch initial data method, which makes a call to fetch the minimal main that is defined in the services.js that we saw earlier. The data that is returned back from this function is then used by the render method to convert into HTML. As you can see, this component in turn uses subcomponents like the header, footer, and it uses the router.js to route the path to the appropriate page component. Now let's take a look at the page.jsx. This is a React component and it also implements some of the lifecycle methods. Here we have the fetch data method that will be called if the page is being rendered client-side, or you have the fetch initial data that will be called if the page is being rendered server-side. Both of these methods make a call to fetch the page data. This method is defined in services.js. The data that is received back from this method is then used by the render method and converted into HTML. As you can see, this makes use of a subcomponent called section, which is defined in the components folder. Let's take a look at the section component. This is also a React component. Section receives much of the data from the page component. However, if an image is also specified in the data, then it makes a client-side call to the server to get its rendition errors. This method is defined in services.js. The render method then takes the data and converts it into HTML to be consumed by the browser. Now let's revisit the minimal sample in the browser once again. As you can see here, this is the home page that is being rendered by the app component as well as the page component. The app component fetches the content item of type minimal main, which has the header and the footer logos and a list of pages. The page component will fetch the data for the specific page. The slug that is passed in is present in the URL. Well, that was it from my end. Thank you for watching this video about how you can use React in conjunction with Oracle Content Management as a headless content management system to build and implement a minimal app. The Oracle Content Management documentation contains all the information regarding this sample that we have covered in this video. You can also find more samples like this on our documentation page. Have fun building.